to a tremendous amount of necessarily inspiration.
I'm having a hard time hearing you, Greg.
Okay,
Everybody sit down and
It's
shut
not
up.
your microphone.
Now.
Thank you.
we're going to get going and focus on the issue of money creation. How money is created, dealing with a subject matter that maybe some of you are not all that familiar with. Until a few years ago, I was, I guess you could say, monetarily illiterate, as I think many people are in our society, given the culture and the lack of education, formal education in this issue, lack of exposure of the issue of money creation in our activist circles, lack of awareness in certainly media, and lack of awareness that we hear about coming from our elected officials, who themselves are, relatively speaking, monetarily illiterate. But we've been dealing with a variety of issues today, as those of you who have stuck with this know, from education to prisons to climate to healthcare to the military or war budget. After all, until 1947 used to be called the War Department, and the head of that was the Secretary of War, and the money for it was the war budget. So in truth in advertising, I guess it's more descriptively should be called that. But we're going to deal with a different matter, starting here, I think, in looking at your own state constitution, which you are and can be, I guess, should be celebrating, since this past week was the anniversary of its adoption back in 1846. And Article 8 of your original Constitution has two sections, well, many sections, but two of them that are relevant for this topic. One dealing with municipal corporations that reads, "No political or municipal corporation shall become a stockholder in any banking corporation directly or indirectly." And second, under banking associations, under Section 5, no act of the General Assembly authorizing or creating corporations or associations with banking powers, nor amendments thereto shall take effect or in any manner be in force until the same shall have been submitted separately to the people at the next general or special election. Pretty powerful stuff. You know, we dealt earlier with the issue of sovereignty and democracy and self-governance. And this is a very democratic provision. Because what it's doing, of course, what it's acknowledging is that people, those who founded this state, were very leery, very fearful, and very concerned about corporations, banking corporations in particular, financial corporations, becoming too potent, that would have too much independent control and definition. So they put the power to define corporations and, in essence, to create them under the power of you, people, directly, not through surrogates, elected representatives, but people directly. That acknowledges the power they felt, financial institutions that have the power to create money that we've given to them has. You know, we tend to think that the public policy tools we have directly and those we elect sort of follow and exist just basically in two legs or two pieces. That those tools we have at our disposal come under the area or arenas of spending decisions or taxing decisions, right? And we can, many of us, can quote hook, line, and sinker issues around, you know, how much money is being spent for this program or that program, or what the tax burden is. Have taxes been raised or reduced for this group or that group? And how can we have greater sane and humane spending priorities or just tax policies? But there's a third tool that is in our democratic public policy toolkit that many people aren't even aware of. And that has to do with monetary issues, which is basically the creation and circulation of money. As Aristotle himself said, money exists not by nature, but by law. He understood that no natural substance, which we tend to think, real money, hard money, gold, silver, whatever, copper in some countries throughout history, that it has inherent value, intrinsic value, therefore it alone should be money. But rather it's government, ultimately, that determines the definition of money. The original colonial currencies, every single colony by 1755 had issued some form of colonial currency. On colonial currency, Franklin said, the effect of paper currency is not understood in England. And indeed, the whole is a mystery to the politicians, how we have been able to continue a war for 4 years against the most potent military force of its day, right? British Army. Without money, and how we could pay with paper that had no previously fixed fund appropriated specifically to redeem it. This currency is a wonderful machine. It performs its office when we issue it, and when we are obligated to issue a quantity excessive, it pays itself off by depreciation. He went on, in other words, to talk about the power and the beauty of colonial money. The colonies would gladly have borne a little tax on tea and other matters had it not been that England took away from the colonies their money, which created unemployment and dissatisfaction. The inability, he said, of the colonists to get power to issue their own money permanently out of the hands of George III and the international bankers was, according to Franklin, the prime reason for the Revolutionary War. So, the colonists took this monetary sovereignty pretty seriously. And even though they were up against the most potent military force and economic of its day, they tried to become independent. And that independence took the form of developing not just individual colony money, but collectively. What money was called the Continentals. $200 million of which was issued in paper money, continental currency or Continentals, that were used to pay soldiers to fight in the war. The U.S. Constitution, so we effectively had revolution against the kings, certainly the king himself, the king's military wings, the redcoats, the king's sort of economic arms, these corporate entities, crown corporations, and they constitutionalized those crown corporations, as I mentioned earlier, but they also, there were some quite a few problematic things of the Constitution. But one thing that they got right and understood and comprehended was that they, in Article 1, Section 8, issued and gave to Congress and to the people, we the people, through the federal legislature, the sole power to coin and regulate the value thereof. And coin is used in this way, not as a noun but as a verb, to create, to originate. That was the power and authority issued to Congress. The U.S. early on chartered, most of the corporations in this country early on were chartered at the state level with one exception, and that were banking corporations. They were chartered at the federal level to provide financial money. And they chartered 2 banks. There was a huge battle about whether that should exist or not. There still really wasn't awareness about an understanding, even among the anti-federalists. A huge battle between the Federalists of Hamilton and the anti-federalists led by Jefferson over how are we going to sort of maintain sovereignty and democracy, and understanding that banks had all of this power. So they created, under the pressure of Hamilton, the first bank of the United States. That was chartered for 20 years. It created, when they issued all of this money, what they did is the bank issued money, a lot of it, and then once people got loans, because that's how money was created, through loans, then they called in those loans right away, creating a financial panic through the monetary creation and contraction. It caused a panic, and that was largely responsible for, by a very narrow margin, the Congress not renewing the charter of the first bank of the United States. A couple of years later, Hamilton and others were successful in lobbying for the charter of the second bank of the US, that after 20 years, it too became too big for its financial britches, and many people felt that was a threat to the body politic, not just to the economy, but to governance. And Jackson's veto message to renew its charter read, "Controlling our currency, receiving our public monies, and holding thousands of our citizens in dependence would be more formidable and dangerous than a naval and military power of the enemy," and was why he felt very strongly that this private, so we do need a central bank. Every country needs a central bank. But the mistake they made was to make that central bank, in those two cases, a private bank. Jefferson said, "I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs." He didn't quite, though, understand how quite to do that. So we had, following that era of the decline and dissolution of the Second Bank of the United States, this era of free banking, where money was issued privately by banks, no central monetary authority, no reserve requirements. Reserve requirements mean you have to have so much money in the bank, and based on that dollar amount, you could lend out, equal to or greater than so many times. So if you have $1,000 in reserve, you could either only lend out $1,000 or multiples of that $1,000. Lincoln created, he sort of was the first, actually his economic advisor, a guy by the name of Henry Carey, first understood and got at the national level the importance of creating US money. This was not money issued by private banks as debt, as loans issued to the government, but as debt-free and inflation-free money. This came about, Lincoln and his backers got behind the 1862 Legal Tender Act that ended up creating these things called greenbacks. Why they were called greenbacks? We tend today to interchange the words dollars with greenbacks. Well, no. Greenbacks were US dollars that had green ink on the back that distinguished them from other bits of currency that was issued by private banks during the preceding period. A total of $450 million was allocated for printing and circulation to pay for the war, and that's how many it was, no more than that. So we fast forward to the Federal Reserve System, which came about following the 1913, as a result of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. This was an example of the third national bank, if you will, a central bank, and yet again a private bank. Created a largely corporate-controlled national banking and currency system authorized to monetize government debt, which means to print their own money and exchange it for government securities or IOUs. The central banking system was composed, and still is, of 12 regional private corporate banks owned by participating commercial banks. By controlling our national monetary faucet, they could create inflation and deflation, just like you being able to, by controlling your faucet on your sink. Turning it on, you have more water that comes in. Turning it off, less water. Same with money. You can create inflation by turning on the monetary spigot. More money out there than what is needed to meet the needs. You want to cause deflation, you turn it off, and can cause panics and the like. The constitutional power for public creation of our power, for public control of our power, was handed over to private banking corporations. It is the ultimate form. You can take privatization of prisons, privatization of water systems, of airports, of water meters, of sewer systems, all of that stuff. Add it up together and it doesn't come anywhere close to the monetary magnitude and the political power influence of giving private entities the power to create money out of thin air.
The only thing is the Federal Reserve's leadership are all appointed by the President, subject to confirmation by the Senate. That's not true of Federal Express.
Well, that is true, although that list that is presented to the President for consideration is prepared by the private Federal Reserve branches and the like. So it is true that in a sense he chooses, but it is a sort of a facade of giving an aura of public sort of choice when that list is pretty well stacked, who those members of the Federal Reserve Board are going to
What does
be.
it mean that were owned by the private banks?
Pardon me?
What does it mean where it says the 12 regional corporate banks were owned by the?
Yeah, they're stock, and the stock is from the local banks. So they are private entities. In fact, if you go, I mean, we have a Federal Reserve Bank in Cleveland, and wherever these are, and there have been several lawsuits as well filed that have reached federal court that have claimed, you're public, private, and every time they have concluded, yeah, it's a private entity. In fact, in those places where there are Federal Reserve Banks, go to the government pages of the phone book. You won't find them there. Look in the business pages, that's where they are. Their employees aren't on the government payroll, they're private. Their pensions, private. They are private entities. There are, a certain few number of features that are public, such as the head of the Federal Reserve, appointed by the president, other members of the Federal Reserve Board appointed, but that's more just surface than reality. So here's how money, basically comes from. The Fed creates all new money as debt from thin air, same with bank. Private banks then take this new money and create 10 times this amount through fractional reserve banking. This process is called the money multiplier process. And banks themselves, individual banks, create money out of thin air when you go to the bank and want a loan. They basically hit a few keystrokes and voila, that $10,000 that you want for a new car, used car, whatever case may be, is created right on the computer. Banks, both as an asset and a liability. Double bookkeeping is what they call it. And voila, banks create that principal. However, they don't create the interest. So, how are you going to figure out how to pay back that interest when that amount wasn't created? Only the principal was. Well, we know, right? You have to pay back when you receive a loan principal. So there isn't enough money in the system. The only way you can come out collectively from a macro standpoint is somebody's got to go into more debt. So it's like, I've heard the metaphor, it's sort of akin to someone who is a drunk to say, you're going to drink yourself sober. How often does that work? Not very often. Same with debt. You're hearing it now in Greece and in other places that in Europe that are suffering and dealing with the austerity measures. Well, the way out of your problem is to go into more debt. Get more debt from the European Central Bank, from the International Monetary Fund, or whatever. Here's some quotes from both Edison and Ford about money. Well, there was a plan during the Depression proposed by 157 academic economists that basically tried to say, you need to do what Lincoln did. Create debt-free money. Don't go into debt to pay for all these alphabet soup programs, but instead issue U.S. money. And the main features of what was called the Chicago Plan was that only the government could create money. The plan separated the loan-making function, which can belong to private banks, from the money creation function, which belongs to governments. It's not saying get rid of banks. Good reason to have banks. But only have banks basically issue money that they have in their deposits, not created out of thin air. And that the proposal recognized the distinction between money and credit, between money as money and credit or debt as debt. And in several respects, it was the precursor for this act that has been introduced called the NEED Act, the National Emergency Employment Act, which was introduced a couple of times in Congress, the last two sessions of Congress, when Representative Dennis Kucinich from my part of the world in Northern Ohio and John Conyers, both in 2011 and 2010. And its main purpose, by it being called the National Emergency Employment Defense Act, was to create jobs and to deal with the debt. And basically what it addresses is, it says we need to sort of take charge and become engaged in the same way that we become engaged, right, in spending decisions by having all sorts of proposals for creating more just and sane and humane budget proposals, or how can we have our tax policies that are more progressive. Well, in the monetary field, let's no longer hand off and privatize, willingly give away the power that we the people have to create our money. And that's what the NEAT Act addresses. It, in light of these growing and persistent monetary-related concerns that are out there, as you can see, from debts and deficits to trade imbalances to unemployment, underemployment, manufacturing concerns of stagnant growth, and all of these wild and bizarre financial quote-unquote products. When you can create money out of thin air, I mean, you've got quite a bit of ability to start speculating and the like. This is a response. Here is a specific plan of action that can address these issues and provide money that we, the people, and those we elect can control to meet our immediate needs. So, here are the provisions. The Federal Reserve is dismantled. However, it's not disintegrating. You know, there's the Ron Paul people out there that said just end the Fed. Maybe some of you have heard of that movement. No, we need a central, every country needs a central bank. So you need certain portions of it to still continue to exist, those portions that do research and development and monitor and track the state of our economy. So the good parts are placed under the U.S. Treasury, and a independent monetary authority is created which decides and determines how much U.S. money, debt-free and inflation-free, is going to be created, that reaches that balancing point to make sure it's neither too much that creates inflation or too little that creates deflation. Second, it has changes into accounting rules that ends this notion of what's called fractional reserve banking. No more can banks leverage funds that they have in their vaults to begin speculating. This is what were the problems, at least one of the root problems, back in 2007, 2008. Banks began just to leverage, the higher leverage, meaning if you are able, as some banks on Wall Street, 20, 30 times what you have at your disposal, that means if you have $1, okay, if you have $1 in the vault, but you can issue $30 or $50, if $2 goes bad as bad loans, you don't have a buck, right? You only have $1, so you're going to go bankrupt, and that's what happened in some cases.
I gotta disagree with that. Fractional reserve banking did not cause the collapse in 2007, 2008. The collapse in 2007, 2008 was securitization of home mortgages, where home mortgages were perceived to be golden, and the home mortgages turned to be bad paper. Then we had the bleed over from the investment banks to the deposit banks to the insurance companies. Glass-Steagall, which was in place from 33 until 99, the repeal of Glass-Steagall really led to that bubble. It wasn't fractional reserve. It wasn't banks making bad loans. It was when banks got into the investment banking business, and we had this bleed over across all segments. Fractional reserve was a minuscule part of that collapse.
But isn't it true that even if that collapse was caused by that fractional reserve creates an incentive for a constant growth at any cost type economy?
One of the things in Iowa is there's an argument that our ag banks went too far out in the 70s and 80s. Right. I can see it. Fractional reserve was not part of that problem. What I call the depository bankers, they don't go out and loan 10 times. They loan 4 times or 5 times. And most of those have a required reserve of 5 to 7 to 8 to 10%. In Iowa, most of them maintain reserves of 20%. They don't go out on the limb as far as, and within the depository banking system in the U.S., you don't see these guys going out and loaning to the limits. Because every night they've got to go back and they've got to balance their accounts with the Fed. Where they got in problems is when they started playing with the JP Morgan Chases, and they started playing the investment game, where they started buying strips, and then they started buying the reverse credit swaps, and all of these.
And the tranches and sold off, yeah.
All these exotic derivatives. But it was not from their core banking business. It was from the investment side.
Well, I think there's a relationship between the two. I mean, certainly when the commercial banks got in, when the firewall between commercial and investment banks as a result of the end of Glass-Steagall occurred. I mean, that opened the door for commercial banks to get into investment banking, vice versa. And I think they're connected. Many things I read said that there is a connection. Certainly the ability of banks to loan out more than what they had at their disposal was a significant factor. Third point, main provision, is that Congress originates U.S. money and spends it into circulation, dealing with our nation, both physical and social infrastructure. Physical being all of those things that are crumbling as we speak, our dams, our roads, bridges, and the like. We saw recently, tragically, not that this was totally the reason for the Amtrak derailment, but certainly not a complete updated technological infrastructure of having the ability to oversee or check human actions was a contributing factor to that derailment. The American Society of Civil Engineers estimates that roughly now, as of last year, $3.6 trillion are needed. You're not going to find that simply by, I mean, we're going to come up with $3.6 trillion. I don't care how much you cut back in social spending or increase taxes, that's just simply, it's just not fundable. We'll have otherwise some serious economic problems. But this fund is also available, not just for physical infrastructure, but to deal with human infrastructure, our schools, education, healthcare. Additional provisions is that it calls for paying off the national debt. You know, all of these debt instruments we have of the U.S., bonds, bills, and notes, as they come due, instead of rolling them over, instead of paying interest on them, just repay them, convert them into U.S. money and U.S. notes. Limited interest rates, the NEAT Act says 8% tops. And it ends compound interest with the rule that total interest may never exceed the principal. It says that a certain amount, 25% of the U.S. money that is created, will go to the states. Just as we had previously block grant funds, to a certain extent we still have community development block grant and the like. Let's put some of that money out there for states and municipalities based on general rules that will be determined nationally, what money can be spent on, like infrastructure, health, education, and the like, but leave it to the municipalities and the states to determine how exactly that infrastructure infrastructure money is going to be used for. And finally, a tax-free dividend is called for. Instead of, what did we give? $700 billion to bail out the banks. We bailed out Wall Street. It never made it to the main street, never mind the side streets or the back streets. How would the economy have done if we had taken that $700 billion and just give everyone a check? Most people, even the banks would have benefited in terms of them competing for deposits. Some people wouldn't have spent money at all. They would have put it in the banks. But many would have gone out and purchased whatever. And that would stimulate, that's what drives economic development. It's when businesses know there's a demand for their product, then they create supply. Why this is possible, in one sense, is because it does, in a sense, what most people believe already exists and has existed for a very long time, thanks to the propaganda and misinformation of the financial interests. You know, most people, you go out on the street and ask them, is the Federal Reserve public? Well, yeah. Does the government issue our money? Well, yeah. And do banks only lend out money they have? Well, sure. Well, in each case, we know that's not true, but most people believe that it is true. So here's this proposal. It's sort of monetary reform jujitsu, in a sense, whereas it's using the financial industry's own propaganda that they have conditioned us to believe to actually say we're for. So it's actually very modest in the eyes of many people when actually it's pretty radical, democratically radical. Of course, there's going to be opposition and threats to trying to institute this from certainly the power elite and their various arms, not just the banking interests or other corporations, or of course the politicians that are purchased or rented by the banks, but certainly all of these other interests. Other threats come from beneficiaries of the financial system, politicians, economists, of course, many of them at the most prestigious universities are there because they are sitting in the chairs that are funded by some of the largest banking institutions. You have neighborhoods, many of them. I mean, you can go around this country and you see a lot of schools or parks or other things. Community development corporations are funded by banks, so certainly they're not going to be too quick to be advocates for something like this. Same with schools. You see new stadiums or other facilities that have been, these big financial companies, banks and insurance companies will underwrite or sponsor, partially pay for some of these institutions. The general public, in a sense, to the degree that they think, oh, this is too hard to understand, eyes glaze over, let's leave it to the Alan Greenspans, Ben Bernankes, and Janet Yellens. They sort of know these things, right? It's intimidating, you don't learn about this, our monetary literacy is sky high, there's confusion. A lot of people, when they talk about, when you bring up the issue of monetary reform, they think, well, banking reform. You mean just sort of reimpose Glass-Steagall, right? Or let's put a transaction tax on anything that takes place between banks. Well, those are debatable and good things to talk about and raise, but those are banking reforms. Those don't necessarily deal with our monetary system. And even among progressives, quote unquote, there's the inside the Beltway nonprofits, what I call what some people anyway call the nonprofit industrial complex. Inside the Beltway of groups that play it safe, where it's okay to talk about and debate and offer prescriptions on spending issues and tax issues, but they won't touch monetary issues. There's a certain elitism associated with it. Oh, it's those cranks and kooks and crazies out there that are the fringe people. And there are some fringe people that have been historically those that talk about monetary issues. And there's been a healthy dose in some quarters of anti-Semites. And it's the Jews that are running the banks. And so we can't, if we're good progressives, we can't be involved in that whole issue.
Let me ask you a historical question. Let's go back to 2009, when the president went through with his first stimulus of $1 trillion, and it turns out that it was not enough. And I would argue part of the reason why the trillion was not enough is there were too many tax cuts and not enough direct stimulus. The president goes back to the Congress and says, let's have a second $1 trillion stimulus. The Congress says no. Under this act, that power to print money also then is taken from the Federal Reserve and given to the Congress. Can you imagine the president going to the Congress and saying, we need to print more money for infrastructure and for stimulus, and the very Congress that includes Chuck Grassley and Steve King saying, no, we're not going to print any more money under the NEED Act. At least with the Federal Reserve, the president could go to Ben Bernanke and say, I can't get any movement from the Republicans. Will you go out and will you engage in quantitative easing, where you will go out and you will buy public debt and you will circulate those dollars? And I would make the argument today, the economy wouldn't be where it's at in 2015, but for the quantitative easing. If we'd waited on the Congress to print money, we would have still been in the throes of the Great Recession that we were in 2009, because the Congress refused to move forward with any stimulus after the first bill.
Some real good questions, and I know we're kind of coming up on time, but very quickly in response, and this actually is the last slide I have. But again, under the NEED Act, it's not Congress that directly creates money. They only approve what is recommended by the Monetary Authority. And that Monetary Authority exists under the Department of Treasury. So here, if you have this group that is, as opposed to the Federal Reserve Board that's more dependent to their participant bankers, and that's who they've served. And quite honestly, I believe if you look at the history of who has benefited from quantitative easing, the $3.6 trillion that's been put into the economy, it has not been the average ordinary person. It's not been communities. This money that's been injected into the system resulted in even greater concentration of power in the banking industries with the smaller banks being purchased by the bigger banks. A lot of that money was injected into the economy for companies to get at ZIRP, zero interest rate, to buy back their own stock to artificially inflate the price. It has benefited, a number of studies have borne out, it has contributed to the growing gap between rich and poor. So I don't think the quantitative easing has been a boon. We are still in a great recession, if you will. I mean, they play around with the numbers. You can look at unemployment and, the U6 figure of, the official unemployment rate is far lower than when you take into account those who are underemployed, those who aren't looking anymore. That's the U6 figure, it's much greater. I think we are still suffering. I mean, you have six years out, and you have growth that minuscule. It's going to be 0% in the first quarter of this year, first half of this year. I think we have some serious problems. Here's the last quote. I think the point you raised, sir, is a very legitimate one. It's one that the NEED Act still has to somewhat grapple with, is how do you make this monetary authority something that is truly independent, that is not directly beholden to Congress, but still nevertheless has some accountability. Yes, Congress ultimately has to decide, and if the monetary authority says, look, we are in a financial problem, the way to get out of it is to put $1 trillion into the economy. If Congress ignores that, how are they going to look? Particularly if what results from that is an economic tank. They're all probably going to be out of office. So what this does is it creates, hopefully, a body, this monetary authority, that is more independent. Why we don't have this, of course, is because, I'll just simply end here, is because in a bit of refreshing candor by Dick Durbin a number of years ago, he said, and the banks, hard to believe at a time when we're facing a banking crisis, that many of the banks created are still the most powerful lobby on Capitol Hill, and they frankly own the place. If we look at governing under the influence, and you look at the Open Secrets website, and you look at the interests, the sectors of those who contribute or invest politically, number one is the fire industry, finance, insurance, and real estate. They have locked down the ability to even debate. I mean, this NEED Act, when it was introduced to Congress, didn't even get a hearing. Didn't even get a hearing. So this represents another example, another issue area, just like all the other ones we've spoken about today, where yes, we need to continue in our respective issue areas, sort of silo-wise, to continue to educate, to continue to advocate, to continue to lobby for change. But ultimately, I believe, we're not going to get out of this governing under the influence of private entities, corporations, and wealthy individuals until we, instead of going vertical, we go horizontal, meaning that we put energy into looking at those issues and those solutions that overarch or undergird, that help us get to first base, if not all the way around the bases, on all of the issues we care about. And for me anyway, that's why, yeah, I try to pay attention and work on this issue, but overarching or undergirding that is this issue of ending corporate constitutional rights and money is speech. Because if we can get behind working for the movement for democracy, working for democracy will make it easier for us to get education, healthcare, a clean environment, prisons that aren't corporatized, and democratic money. So I think, yes, we need to keep continuing to go vertical, but at least some of our energy has to go, I believe, respectfully, horizontal. Thanks.